The words cracked through the courtroom like a gunshot. For a moment, there was nothing. No movement, no sound. Just the echo of Judge Thomas's voice hanging in the air like a verdict on the very idea of justice itself. The gavel struck once, sharp and final, and every head turned toward Jasmine Crockett. Her eyes widened. Not in fear, but in a stunned silence that mirrored the disbelief flooding the chamber. 500 million. A number so absurd it felt like satire. Yet here it was, stamped with the authority of the court. The journalists in the front row fumbled with cameras, lenses clicking in frantic bursts. Someone gasped audibly, and another muttered, "That can't be real." But it was. Judge Thomas leaned back, the corners of his mouth tightening with the satisfaction of a man who believed he had delivered the ultimate humiliation. He didn't just fine her, he attempted to. Bury her under a mountain of debt so astronomical it would strip any ordinary citizen of hope. His robe looked less like a symbol of fairness and more like the armor of unchecked power. Crockett sat motionless, her face illuminated by the harsh overhead lights. To one side, a row of young interns scribbled furiously, as if writing down history in real time. To the other, allies and critics alike sat frozen, the room divided between triumph and outrage. It was a performance, and Thomas was savoring the role he had cast himself in: judge, executioner, untouchable authority. But beneath the surface of Crockett's stillness was something he could not see.
At every slight,
Every insult, every barrier. She had broken to stand in this very room, coiled inside her like a spring. Her silence wasn't surrender, it was calculation. The courtroom buzz began to return, whispers rippling through the benches. A reporter whispered, $500 million. Dollars? For what? The absurdity of it wasn't lost on anyone. This wasn't lit with spectacle, and as Judge Thomas's gavel rested smugly on the bench, one not the press, not the spectators. Not even the judge himself realized the miscalculation that had just been made, because Jasmine Crockett was not about to fold, but nobody knew, not even Judge Thomas, how fast the tables were about to turn. Judge Thomas hadn't chosen $500 million by accident. He could have ruled smaller, symbolic, even punitive. But no, he wanted a number so colossal it would echo across headlines, rattle her allies, and send a chilling signal to anyone daring to challenge power cloaked in robes. Ow. It wasn't about money. It was about spectacle, about crushing defiance. Beneath the weight of impossible mathematics, to find Jasmine Crockett $500 million was to say, you don't belong here. You may have fought your way into Congress, but the system can still swat you back down. You may have a seat at the table, but we control the table itself. For many in that courtroom, the math was insulting in its excess, almost cartoonish. But for those who understood history, it wasn't just excess, it was strategy. Throughout America's story, power has often used wealth, or the lack of it, as a weapon. From poll taxes to redlining, from bail systems designed to punish poverty, to legal battles where only the rich can afford justice. Money has been the invisible whip that disciplines dissent. And here, in 2025, Judge Thomas wielded that same weapon. Against a young black congresswoman whose very presence in halls of power had unsettled the old order. Crockett represented more than herself. She was the voice of communities often ignored, the embodiment of an America still fighting to live up to its promises. Silencing her wasn't just about shutting down one woman, it was about warning every person watching that some truths would always come at too high a price. The optics were impossible to ignore. A white, powerful judge towering above a black woman, leveraging a figure so ludicrous it bordered on parody yet cloaked in the authority of law. It demanded to be taken seriously, and the cameras made sure the entire country witnessed it. Every shot of Crockett sitting in stunned silence, every replay of Thomas's words, every headline screaming $500 million fine was fuel for a deeper conversation. Who gets to speak freely in America? Who pays the price when they do? The answer, as this moment showed, was devastatingly clear. The system was not designed to punish all equally, it was designed to remind some of their place. Yet, what Thomas did not anticipate was how visible that imbalance would look when magnified on national screens. To millions watching, it wasn't law at work. It wasn't impartiality. It wasn't impartiality, it was arrogance. His attempt at silencing had instead amplified her voice, even in her silence. Because people didn't just see Jasmine Crockett. Fine, they saw themselves threatened, their communities mocked, their values belittled. And outrage began to flicker. Tweets multiplied. Editorials drafted in real time. Pundits preparing their evening monologues already sensed the story forming. A courtroom drama that was less about legality than about power itself. Thomas believed he had delivered the final word. What he had actually done was spark the opening chapter of a much larger fight. The stakes were no longer personal, they were national. To let this stand would mean conceding that justice was something you could price out, that dignity itself could be auctioned to the highest bidder. To fight it meant more than defending Crockett, meant defending the idea of America as a place where truth could still rise above intimidation. And to understand how dangerous this was, we need to look at the man behind the gavel. Judge Thomas was not a man unfamiliar with the spotlight. For years he had cultivated it, polishing his image as a strict guardian of the law. The kind of figure television producers loved to book for sound bites. He lectured endlessly about restoring dignity to the courts and holding America accountable to its founding principles. To his admirers, he was a bulwark against chaos. To his critics, he was the embodiment of arrogance wrapped in a black robe. But beneath the speeches and carefully staged appearances lay a story the judge never wanted the public to see. He had risen through the ranks, not purely on merit, but through connections, an elite network of donors, political fixers, and corporate allies who ensured his climb. While he thundered from the bench about ethics, he quietly accepted lavish gifts, luxury trips on private jets, retreats at secluded resorts, envelopes thick with consulting fees. Each one tethered him not to the law, but to the wealthiest sliver of society. He wielded his robe-like armor, the black fabric shielding him from scrutiny. The gavel in his hand was less a symbol of justice than a weapon slamming down not just on cases, but on lives. He relished the performance, the crack of wood on wood echoing like a warning to anyone bold enough to question him. His rulings carried the sting of ego, harsh penalties for those who defied him, leniency for allies who kept his name in their circles. Thomas spoke of fairness, yet his record told another story. Cases involving powerful corporations curiously tilted in their favor. Political operatives with the right connections found leniency. Ordinary citizens, especially those from marginalized backgrounds, felt the full weight of his sentences. When questioned about discrepancies, Thomas would smile thinly and offer one of his rehearsed lines. Justice may be blind, but it is not naive. To his supporters, it sounded wise. To those who suffered, it sounded like mockery. He thrived on intimidation. Lawyers whispered about his temper, how a misplaced word could draw an icy glare that seemed to stretch the minutes into hours. Journalists noted his habit of grandstanding in the courtroom, turning routine hearings into morality plays where he starred as both teacher and executioner. He wasn't satisfied with simply ruling. He needed to humiliate, to remind the room that he was not just the law, but the story itself. And yet, despite his power, cracks in the facade had long been visible. Rumors swirled of questionable financial dealings, of backroom meetings with lobbyists, of favors exchanged in smoky rooms. Still, Thomas remained untouchable. Protected by prestige, buffered by wealth, he projected the certainty of a man who believed the rules existed only for others. When he looked at Jasmine Crockett, he didn't just see a congresswoman. He saw an intruder, a young black woman who dared to speak truth where silence was expected. A lawmaker who represented the very communities his rulings had often overlooked. To Thomas, her confidence was insolence, her presence in power an affront. To the hierarchy he had spent his career reinforcing. And so, when the opportunity came to strike, he did so with a flourish. $500 million. A number chosen not out of legal necessity, but out of spiteful theater. In his mind, it was a masterstroke. Crockett would be broken, headlines would trumpet his dominance, and every potential challenger would think twice before crossing him.
Hell yeah.
The robe made him untouchable. The gavel gave him the stage, and arrogance told him the script was already written. But arrogance has a way of blinding even the most calculating men. Thomas believed himself the author of this drama, the director of a performance where everyone else was merely cast in supporting roles. What he never realized was that every performance has an audience. And audiences see more than the actor intends to reveal. The smirk, the excess, the blatant imbalance. It was all on display, and as the cameras zoomed in, as the gasps replayed, across living rooms nationwide, people weren't seeing justice. They were seeing a man who had confused his power with infallibility. A man more comfortable serving privilege than serving the truth, and that was the flaw he could never gavel away. But while he sat high above the bench, another story had been unfolding, one that would shake the courtroom to its core. Long before Jasmine Crockett ever set foot in that courtroom, she had been fighting uphill battles. She wasn't born into privilege. She didn't grow up in marble halls or inherit connections. She grew up in a country that often told girls, like her, black, ambitious, unafraid that their dreams were too loud, too inconvenient, too much. Yet every no she heard became fuel. Every wall placed in front of her became something to climb. Her story began in the neighborhoods where struggle was not an abstract concept, but daily reality. She saw families working 2 jobs and still barely scraping by. She saw classrooms, underfunded teachers stretched thin, kids with talent and brilliance overlooked because their zip codes carried more weight than their potential. These weren't stories she read about. They were the stories of her neighbors, her friends, her family. From the start, Crockett learned that survival required more than grit, it required voice. As a young student, she spoke up when rules didn't make sense, when resources weren't fairly distributed, when someone else was being ignored. Teachers labeled her outspoken, sometimes as praise, often as warning. But even then, she knew that silence was never neutral. Silence meant acceptance, and she refused to accept a world that told her and others like her they were less than enough. Her path to law was no accident. She saw in the courtroom both the sharpest blade of oppression and the most powerful tool of liberation. She decided early on she would learn to wield it. Law school was not easy. She didn't glide through doors opened by family connections. She pushed, clawed, and fought her way in, carrying with her the burden of expectation, not just to succeed, but to prove wrong everyone who doubted her, and she did. As an attorney, Crockett earned a reputation for defending those no one else wanted to defend. Protesters arrested for demanding justice, families trapped in housing disputes, clients written off as hopeless. She saw in each case a reflection of her own community, people told they didn't belong, that their voices didn't matter. With every defense, she sharpened her skills not just as a lawyer, but as a fighter for dignity. The insults came with the territory. Colleagues called her too aggressive. Opponents dismissed her as emotional. Commentators accused her of playing identity politics. Every label meant to shrink her only hardened her resolve. Every insult she had endured became armor. And unlike Judge Thomas, who wrapped himself in a robe of borrowed authority, Crockett's armor was forged from lived experience, resilience, and the unshakable belief that she belonged. Her rise to Congress shocked some, but inspired many. She wasn't supposed to make it. She didn't have billionaire donors lining her pockets. What she had were people, ordinary voters who saw themselves in her story, who recognized the fight in her as the same fight they carried every day. Her campaign wasn't built in banquet halls. It was built on porches, in church basements, in classrooms, and on street corners where the promise of democracy had too often been broken. When she won, she carried more than a title. She carried expectations, hopes, and fears of communities long overlooked. And she did not shrink from that weight. In Congress, she spoke with the same fire that had marked her youth, unafraid to challenge colleagues, unapologetic in defending the marginalized. She wasn't there to play politics. She was there to speak truth, even when it rattled those around her, especially when it rattled those around her. It was this very defiance, this refusal to bow that made her a target. Figures like Judge Thomas saw in Crockett not just an opponent but a threat. She represented everything they had. Spent careers keeping at bay. Youth, blackness, fearlessness, and the audacity to stand in spaces not designed for her. For Thomas's Crockett's presence was intolerable. For Crockett, Thomas's power was just another wall to climb. And so, on that day in the courtroom, when the gavel came down with the weight of $500 million, Crockett was not just a woman blindsided by injustice. She was a lifetime of struggle incarnate, a story stitched from defiance, empathy, and resilience. The fine was staggering, yes, but she had faced staggering odds before. The difference now was that the entire nation was watching. The girl once dismissed as too outspoken had become a congresswoman staring down a judge who believed his authority unshakable. The clash was bigger than numbers, bigger than one courtroom. It was a collision between two Americas, one that silences, and one that refuses to be silenced. Jasmine Crockett had not asked for this stage, but she was ready for it. She carried her community, her past, her scars, and her victories into that chamber. And while Judge Thomas believed he had written her ending, he was about to learn what happens when a woman who has survived every dismissal, every insult, locked door decides to fight back with the whole country watching, and that armor was about to clash with the most powerful weapon Judge Thomas thought he had. The gavel came down again, this time harder, echoing through the chamber like a thunderclap. Judge Thomas leaned forward, his eyes narrowing into slits. His voice rose, booming across the courtroom, each word dripping with contempt. Do you think this is a game, Congresswoman? Do you think the law bends simply because you demand it? You will pay this fine, you will accept this judgment. And you will learn what it means to face real authority. His face flushed red, each syllable sharper than the last. The courtroom shrank under his tone, the air thick with intimidation. Reporters typed frantically, their screens glowing as every outburst was preserved for the world beyond those walls. Spectators shifted in their seats, some averting their eyes, others staring transfixed at the raw spectacle of power being wielded like a weapon. But Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. She leaned back slightly, her hands folded neatly on the table, her gaze fixed squarely on the man towering over her. The contrast was striking, his rage a storm, her silence a calm horizon. Every second she refused to match his fury was a second the balance of control began to wobble. When she finally spoke, her tone was even measured, steady. With all due respect, Your Honor, authority and justice are not the same thing. Rooms stirred, a ripple of whispers passing through the benches. Thomas's jaw clenched, his hand tightening on the gavel as though the wood itself might keep his grip on power intact. He leaned in further, his voice cutting across her words like a blade. You come into my courtroom and you dare lecture me on justice. You, a politician who panders for applause. You think your speeches and your slogans can erase the authority of this bench? His words cracked like whips, but Crockett did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. She looked at him with the poise of someone who had heard insults before, who had been underestimated 1,000 times, and who knew the strength of restraint. Her calm was louder than his fury. The authority of this bench, she replied softly, is only as strong as the integrity behind it. It was a line spoken almost in a whisper, but the silence that followed made it thunderous. The judge blinked, momentarily thrown. Cameras zoomed in, reporters paused their typing, spectators froze. Thomas recovered quickly, his anger sharpening. Into a sneer? You dare question my integrity? I am the law here, I decide. Not you, not the public, not anyone. His voice cracked on the last word, the first faint fracture in what had been a wall of dominance. Crockett's eyes never left. She didn't smile, didn't gloat, didn't break her steady rhythm. Her refusal to meet fire with fire was its own quiet defiance. The more he raged, the smaller he appeared next to her composure. The tension built like a wire stretched too, tight. Every gasp, every shuffle in the benches, every flash of a camera bulb seemed to tighten it further. The audience wasn't just watching, they were holding their breath, waiting to see who would break first. Thomas raised the gavel again, slamming it down with a force that rattled the microphones. Order, he barked, his voice cracking in two. A hoarse command. But the sound no longer carried the same weight. The more he shouted, the more it felt like desperation. like a man trying to convince himself that control hadn't already begun to slip away. Crockett simply sat, unshaken, and when she finally leaned forward, ready to speak again, the entire courtroom leaned with her. Then, with the court on edge, Crockett delivered the first line that flipped the room. For a heartbeat, the room was suspended in silence. The judge's words still hovered, thick with arrogance. When Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, her voice calm but cutting through the air like a blade. "Your Honor," she began, pausing deliberately between each word, $500 million is not justice. It is punishment without purpose, a number so detached from reality that it belongs in headlines, not in law. The words landed with a weight far greater than her volume. Murmurs stirred in the benches. Porters shifted, pens hovering, fingers frozen above keyboards. Even Thomas, who had moments before sat so comfortably in his throne, blinked just once, but enough for the cameras to catch. Crockett straightened, her eyes unyielding. "You say you are the law?" "But the law," she paused again, letting the moment stretch, "has limits. And those limits are called precedent." She reached into her binder, the crisp sound of pages flipping filling the silence. United States v. Bojikajian, the Supreme Court ruled that excessive fines violate the Eighth Amendment. They called them unconstitutional. They called them unjust. Another pause. And yet here we are. $500 million. The courtroom hummed louder now, a low vibration of recognition. She had not only stood her ground, she had brought the Constitution itself into the battle. Thomas's lips tightened. "Perhaps," she continued, her tone still steady, "you've forgotten the words of Justice Ginsburg in Timms v. Indiana. Protection against excessive fines has been a constant shield throughout Anglo-American history." Her eyes locked on Thomas. "A shield, Judge, not a sword." The line hit like a spark in dry grass. A few gasps escaped, followed by whispers growing louder. Someone in the gallery muttered, "She's right." The judge shifted in his seat, tugging at his robe as though suddenly uncomfortable in the very garment he had once worn like armor. But Crockett was not finished. She leaned forward again, her voice lower now, forcing the audience to lean with her. "The irony, Judge Thomas, is that you lecture others about respecting the law while treating it like a stage for your performance. You wield the gavel not as a tool of balance, but as a weapon of ego." The silence that followed was electric. Every camera was trained on her, every spectator waiting for the reaction. Thomas's face flushed deeper, a bead of sweat forming at his temple. He tried to interject, "Congresswoman, you will not," but she raised her hand slightly. Not to silence him, but to remind the room that she had the floor now. Her control was quiet, undeniable. "This fine," she pressed on, "is not about law. It's about intimidation. It's about silencing a voice that makes you uncomfortable. A young black congresswoman who refuses to bow, who dares to say that justice belongs to everyone, not just to the powerful. That is what you're punishing today." The gallery erupted in murmurs, some heads nodding, others whispering furiously. Thomas slammed his gavel, the sound desperate now, rather than commanding. "Order," he barked. "This is out of line." But Crockett did not raise her voice. She let his shout hang in the air before answering, softly but firmly. "No, Your Honor. What is out of line is the idea that justice can be priced. What is out of line is believing that fear can silence truth." And then she paused, long enough for every eye to lock on her, long enough for the silence to thicken until the next words rang like a bell. "You cannot find me into silence. You cannot bankrupt dignity. And you cannot bury justice under $500 million. The room gasped. For a moment, it was as if the walls themselves recoiled. Thomas's hand hovered above the gavel, but did not strike. His face was crimson. Now his mouth opening, but no words coming. The gavel, the robe. The authorities suddenly, they looked less like symbols of power and more like props in a performance gone wrong. Crockett pressed forward, her voice rising just slightly, just enough to break the silence. "This chamber belongs to the people. This Constitution belongs to the people. And your attempt to twist both into weapons against them, against me, will not stand." The gallery broke. Applause erupted, scattered at first, then swelling into a wave that Thomas's shouts of order could not contain. Spectators stood, clapping, some even cheering. The courtroom transformed from a chamber of intimidation into an arena of defiance. The cameras caught every second, broadcasting it live, unstoppable. Gonkla. Thomas slammed his gavel again and again, the sound drowned out by the applause. His face was a mask of fury and disbelief. For the first time, the judge, who had spent a lifetime commanding silence, was himself silenced by the roar of the people. Crockett did not smile. She did not bask. She simply lowered her eyes briefly, then lifted them again, steady and unflinching. Her point had been made. The tide had turned. When the noise finally subsided, she spoke once more, this time quieter, but with the same certainty that had carried her through. "You can strike your gavel, Judge Thomas, but the echo that remains will not be yours. It will be ours." The final words hung in the air like a verdict of their own. For the first time, Thomas's robe looked heavy on his shoulders, his gavel nothing more than wood in his hand. The silence that followed was not the silence of submission, it was the silence of a shift, the pause before a new story began to unfold, and though the walls of that courtroom could barely contain the moment, the world outside was already waiting to erupt. But what happened outside the courtroom would take this fight to an entirely different level. The gavel's last echo had barely faded when the world outside the courthouse erupted. Within minutes, phones buzzed in every corner of the country. Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, every platform lit up like wildfire. One hashtag rose above the noise, climbing trend charts with dizzying speed. Hashtag Crockett vs. Thomas. Clips of the exchange ricocheted across feeds. The moment she declared, "You cannot bankrupt dignity," looped endlessly, set to music slowed down. For a dramatic effect, remixed into speeches, stitched into dances. The internet crowned it not just a clapback, but a turning point. The kind of viral lightning bolt that felt less like entertainment and more like history writing itself in real time. Commentators rushed to weigh in. Progressive anchors called her takedown a masterclass in courage. Editorial boards described it as the most important moment in a courtroom since Watergate. Even late-night comedians, usually resigned to mockery, spoke with reverence, before launching into punchlines at Thomas's expense. And, oh, the memes. One showed Judge Thomas drowning beneath a tidal wave labeled "Precedent" as Crockett surfed calmly above. Another looped his reddening face with the caption, "When you realize the Constitution isn't on your side." The gavel, once his weapon, became a symbol of his defeat, photoshopped into everything from broken pencils to toy hammers in the hands of toddlers. Celebrities chimed in. A-list actors tweeted their support. Singers dedicated lyrics mid-concert. Athletes scrawled hashtag Crockett vs. Thomas on their sneakers before games. Even those who rarely waded into politics felt compelled to join the chorus, sensing that to stay silent now was to miss standing on the right side of something seismic. But it wasn't just the famous. Ordinary people flooded timelines with stories of their own fights against injustice. Teachers posted about being silenced by administrators. Workers wrote about speaking up to bosses. Immigrants, parents, and students alike said watching Crockett stand tall felt like watching themselves win. Her words became a mirror, reflecting the battles millions had endured in smaller, quieter rooms. The support reached Capitol Hill. Lawmakers who once treated Crockett as a rising but underestimated voice now spoke her name with newfound respect. Colleagues quoted her in speeches, weaving her courtroom lines into debates. The White House press corps asked about her daily. In one weekend, she had transformed from freshman legislator into a symbol of unflinching defiance against corruption. Meanwhile, Thomas became a punchline. Editorial cartoons painted him as a red-faced monarch toppled from his throne. Protest signs outside the courthouse bore his image alongside the words, 500 million lies. The robe that once shielded him now appeared in sketches as a cloak of cowardice. He had gone from commanding fear to inviting ridicule, a transformation, both brutal and irreversible. But the most powerful ripple was less visible. Across living rooms, classrooms, and community centers, people felt something stir. For many, politics had long seemed rigged, tilted toward wealth and power, draining the hope out of ordinary voices. Yet here was a woman, young, black, unapologetically, herself standing in the lion's den, and not just surviving, but flipping the entire cage upside down. The energy was contagious. Petitions circulated. Grassroots fundraisers soared. Activist groups reported record signups. Crockett taught us we don't have to whisper, one organizer said. We can roar. Even the language shifted. Phrases from her speech became shorthand for defiance. You cannot bankrupt dignity, printed on t-shirts, painted on murals, whispered in classrooms before exams, posted above workplace break rooms. She hadn't just fought for herself, she had handed people new words to fight with. The media dubbed it the Crockett effect. Supporters called it something simpler: hope. The sense that maybe, just maybe, one voice against a gavel could tilt the balance. Yet amid the memes, the applause, and the tidal wave of validation, Crockett herself remained steady. She thanked supporters, but she reminded them the fight wasn't about her ego. She spoke of communities silenced, of systems that had punished voices like hers for generations. Her humility only deepened the resonance. And still, the question lingered in every headline, every segment, every viral clip. What happens next? Could this moment be harnessed into real change, or would it fade? Like so many viral sensations before it, the nation waited for her next move. Supporters braced for the backlash they knew was coming. And even Thomas's allies, scrambling to contain the fallout, admitted privately that the battle lines had shifted. The shockwaves had spread far and wide. But for Jasmine Crockett, this wasn't just about a viral moment. It was about something far bigger. The courtroom was long behind her, yet the echo of that gavel still lingered in America's ears. Reporters chased her for quotes, pundits dissected her words. But when Jasmine Crockett finally stepped to the podium, she didn't speak with the bitterness of someone wronged. She spoke with the conviction of someone who had seen beyond her own fight. They thought the fine would break me, she said, her voice carrying not just to the crowd in front of her, but to the millions watching online. But this was never about one person, one penalty, or even one courtroom. This was about what happens when power tries to silence truth. And that, she paused, letting the silence thicken, is something no number on a page can ever accomplish. The fine had been outrageous, but Crockett reframed it as something larger, a symbol of how the system used wealth as a weapon. They can fine us, they can suspend us, they can try to erase us with the stroke of a pen, she continued. But they cannot erase our voices, they cannot bankrupt dignity, they cannot silence justice. Her words cut through cynicism like light through fog. This wasn't rhetoric for headlines, it was a rallying cry for everyone who had ever been told their voice didn't matter. She transformed what was meant as punishment into a beacon. Every dollar of that fine became proof of how desperate the system was to stop her. And in that desperation, they had revealed their fear. Crockett reminded the nation of her roots, growing up where doors were closed, where expectations were low, where every success meant defying an invisible ceiling. She spoke of the teachers who had dismissed her, the officials who had underestimated her, the rules written to exclude her. Every insult, she told the crowd, became my armor. Every barrier, my training ground. And today, that armor does not just protect MIT, protects every one of us who refuses to bow. The audience roared, but she raised her hand for, "Come, this is not about me," she said firmly. "It's about us. It's about building a country where justice isn't determined by the size of your bank account, where dignity isn't reserved for the wealthy, where every child, whether born in the richest suburb or the poorest block, knows their voice can carry." In that moment, the fine no longer looked like a sentence. It looked like a spark that could ignite movements, fuel marches, write new laws. Crockett had taken the very tool meant to crush her and transformed it into a weapon of hope. Her closing words rippled across the nation. They can fine us, silence us, drag our names through the mud. But every time they try, we rise higher. Because voices cannot be confiscated. Because dignity cannot be sold. because justice cannot be chained. The crowd erupted, not with the applause of spectators, but with the conviction of believers. People clapped, shouted, cried not for Crockett alone, but for themselves, for their families, for a vision of a country that finally felt within reach. And as the cheers swelled into chants, the cameras caught something rare, a leader who had taken her own wound and turned it into collective strength. She wasn't just fighting back, she was calling people forward. For many, it felt like a line in the sand. The fine no longer stood as a punishment. It stood as a reminder of what happens when courage refuses to yield. Crockett's defiance had become a universal truth, no matter how heavy the gavel falls. The human spirit rises stronger, and yet even as the applause echoed, another storm was brewing. $500 million. That was the number meant to silence her, the headline designed to shame her, the hammer Judge Thomas thought would crush her spirit, but instead it became the headline of a moral victory. What was intended as punishment became proof of resilience. What was meant to bury Jasmine Crockett only raised her higher end with her. The voices of millions who saw themselves in her fight. This wasn't just about one congresswoman standing in a courtroom. It was about all of us watching, realizing that dignity cannot be auctioned off, that truth cannot be fined out of existence. It was about witnessing the impossible a moment when arrogance tried to choke democracy. Democracy answered back through the voice of someone who refused to be broken. And now, the story doesn't belong to Judge Thomas, or even to Jasmine Crockett alone. It belongs to everyone who believes power must answer to the people, not the other way around. So here's the call. Don't just watch this moment, be part of it. Share this story. Subscribe so that every time dignity speaks truth to power, you are there to amplify it. Because history is not written by the gavels that fall, it's written by the voices that rise. When courage takes the mic, history listens. When we stand together, no fine, no threat, no wall of power can keep us silent. The gavel struck, the headline read. But the final word? That belongs to us,